As I say, welcome along. With this session, I was asked to produce something on criminal exploitation of vulnerable adults, and it's a really interesting topic because exploitation, when it comes to the safeguarding world, and certainly the police, the health service, and most councils, the focus is on children. Many of you will have heard the terms child sexual exploitation or child criminal exploitation, and the focus is very much on the under 18s. But it's very, very clear that vulnerable adults are just as much at risk of exploitation as children are, and particularly ones that we need to be careful of are those that are leaving the care system as they turn 18 and transitioning and are very vulnerable young adults. So what I'm hoping to do with this session, it should take about 50 minutes, I hope, so we would be finished with a bit of luck by 1 o'clock, is to take you through several different aspects of this. Firstly, we're going to look at what actually exploitation is, just to give you some clarity on that. Then we'll look at how exploitation in vulnerable adult occurs, how do people find themselves trapped in this situation, and who is most likely to be vulnerable. That doesn't mean that anyone is safe, shall we say, but what sort of factors make you more vulnerable to exploitation. Then we'll look at some of the offences that the police look at if we have a case of vulnerable adult exploitation, because there is no such criminal offence as vulnerable adult exploitation. It doesn't exist. So we have to look at some of the alternative charges and offences that we might see. Having explored sort of the background to it, we're then going to try and turn it into a more practical session towards the end and give you some advice on what signs to look out for. When you're on your day-to-day business, what is an indication that the adult that you're dealing with may be either vulnerable to or already being exploited. Once you've identified that, what should you do? What are the steps you personally can take if you encounter this situation? And finally, it's always useful to know, if somebody asks you, I'm a bit worried about this, where can you signpost them to? What agencies exist to help them? Now, there will be some questions as we go through, nothing particularly tricky, but I would be grateful if you're willing to put your answers in the chat as we go along, as I ask those questions, because it does make it a bit more interactive and it's nice to see some entertainment there. But we're going to start with exploitation itself. What is exploitation? Well, first thing to say is most people see exploitation with a victim. So it's the exploitation of this vulnerable adult or exploitation of this child. It's not, strictly speaking, the case. Exploitation talks about an imbalance of power, and the exploitation occurs when that power is exploited. Because we are often, in most of our lives, we will have people who have power over us or who we have power over. Now, obviously, with children being younger and more vulnerable, the difference in power is, and the imbalance there is much easier to see. But even though we all have this situation, most of us don't exploit that imbalance. It's when someone exploits it to coerce, manipulate, or deceive someone into one of several things that it becomes criminal exploitation. Firstly, most widely known is sexual activity. I'm sure all of you probably are aware of the Rochdale grooming gangs and things like that, where the imbalance of power was abused in order to persuade children and young adults into sexual activity against their will. Criminal activity, we're going to be looking later on at county lines in particular, but drug activity is a very, very common source of exploitation in vulnerable adults. But it doesn't have to be those two. Often, exploitation in vulnerable adults is in exchange for something that the victim wants or needs. So they tell them to do something, and we're going to go into this in a bit more depth on the next slide, but they tell them to do something that they're not really happy to do in order to gain something that they need. Quite a common one we see with vulnerable adults is for financial advantage of the perpetrator, when we've got a member of the family, sometimes even a carer or something like that, who has access to the victim's bank accounts and uses that imbalance of power to take financial advantage of the victim. And then most commonly what we see in exploitation is violence or threats of violence. That is where the power exists, when someone is in fear for themselves or their family, and the perpetrator can get them to do things that they don't want to do because of that threat of violence. So that's what exploitation is all about. I don't expect any of that to be groundbreaking. We're going to look at how adults get involved in exploitation. What actually happens to them to get them into this situation? For example, the very first category is to offer an exchange. And this is a very, very common one. It's a slippery slope, basically, where the perpetrator will offer the victim something such as money, clothes, drugs, the latest iPhone, whatever it may be, in exchange for doing them a service. Take this package down to this address for me and I'll give you 50 quid cash in hand. It's well known that a lot of these offenders will specifically target places like homeless shelters, food banks, soup kitchens, where they know that the vulnerable are going to be who have very little to their name and who are most likely to be persuadable to do something they wouldn't be happy to do otherwise in exchange for a gift. Second most common probably is just simply the physical violence or the threats of violence. Quite understandably, if someone is in fear of their well-being or their family's well-being, then they are far more likely to do something they wouldn't do without that coercion. At the harsh end of the scale, the very serious one, you can get into abduction and kidnapping. It tends to be, when we're talking exploitation, it tends to be around drugs in this situation, where someone will be taken away forcibly and held in a location away from their home. But one of the more insidious ways to exploit someone is to use emotional abuse, psychological coercive control. I'm sure many of you have had training on coercive controlling behaviour in a domestic relationship. It's very similar behaviour here. It's manipulation, threats, control, even monitoring the movements of the victim so that they know they're under the microscope the whole time, and it is hugely affecting. We've already discussed Rochdale and the factor of sexual abuse, but it can be used as a tool itself. Within a relationship, especially if it's someone with power over the person that they're sleeping with, then it can be used in that way as an exploitative tool. Which leads us on to the next one. If they get them to do something that they're not comfortable with, they can then use that behaviour as blackmail to continue behaving in a way they don't want to. I'm sure many of you have heard of the term sextortion. It's a big problem at the moment on the internet, where people are convinced that they're emailing someone that they're attracted to who sends them nude images, and they send them back or do unspeakable things in front of the camera, at which point the perpetrator reveals that they're not actually the person that the victim thought they were and threatens to release these images to friends, family, bosses, workmates, and so on, unless money is paid. It's a big problem because of the huge embarrassment factor to the victim. We're having more and more problems nowadays with online exploitation. So over social media, on apps, gaming sites, and anywhere that you can chat, that can be used to exploit victims, to try to manipulate them into believing that they're in a genuine relationship when they haven't even met this person, and that they can be trusted, and they give away more information than they should. There are sometimes fraudulent job adverts which seem legitimate, or they can be cyber stalked. The online version of exploitation is quite a significant problem at the moment. I'm hoping you're all familiar with the term cuckooing. We are going to look at it in a bit of depth later on, but basically this is where a vulnerable person has their house taken over by their exploiter. Again, predominantly this is in the drugs trade, where the person selling the drugs does not want to implicate their home address or whatever. They need a base to sell from, and so they will move into one of their clients' addresses, not allowing them any freedom of movement. They're then under the microscope the whole time, and they have no safe haven. no place to call home. Debt bondage is one you might not have heard the term before, but I'm sure you're familiar with the concept. It's a form of entrapment. The victim owes money to their exploiters and they're made to repay that debt, either financially, but normally the sums that are talked about are far too high for them to manage that, or through another means such as transporting drugs. And it is one way that the exploiters deliberately trap their victims. So imagine they go to a homeless shelter, they bump into John Smith, who's very down on his luck, and they say, if you take this package to this address, we'll give you 50 quid cash in hand. John Smith says, yeah, happy with that, I could do with the money, etc., and delivers it. This goes on for a few weeks. He gets more and more, and eventually he gets given a large quantity of drugs to look after. On his way to the address, he's mugged. The drugs and his money are stolen. And his abuser, his exploiter, isn't very sympathetic. He will say, well, I'm sorry, that's now, you owe me for all those drugs that were stolen from you and the money that was taken. You can work off your debt by continuing in this relationship. What the victim doesn't realise is that the robbery was set up by the exploiter to put them in debt bondage, and they feel utterly trapped. And then finally, we mentioned this on the last slide, financial exploitation, when it is direct access to someone's bank account, or they're given an allowance and to the carer or to the family member who skims off most of it and exploits financially their victim. So these are the most common forms of exploitation that we see in vulnerable adults. Now, I'd like you in the chat, can you put in, from your experience, you'll have dealt with vulnerable adults in these situations, what sort of things, what factors do you think make adults more vulnerable to exploitation than others? If you can just pop it in the chat bar, I'd be very grateful. Care leavers, excellent. Disability, lack of family support, learning disability, certainly. All of these are excellent answers. I'll just give you a minute or so. Mental health, definitely. Poverty, without a doubt. Mental health again. Yeah, mental health's a big one. Sen, brilliant. It's really nice that you specifically put in there about neurodivergence. Carer role, peer pressure, drug dependency. I love that you've basically written this slide for me. Sudden life changes, grief. Yeah, if they're vulnerable emotionally, they're far more likely to be vulnerable to exploitation. So let's go through and see what the government says are the key factors. Firstly, it seems obvious when you first see it, previous involvement with crime. Well, yeah, obviously, if they're drug users and they've got convictions for drugs, then they're going to be likely to be involved in exploitation as well. But what research has found is that even minor offences, for offences that don't appear to have any relation to county lines, leave you more vulnerable to exploitation in the future. I've just spotted, oh yeah, we've got another couple of answers come up. Acquired brain injury is an excellent one, and alcohol dependency as well. Definitely, as we go through, you'll see. Some of them are going to be on here. Historic or current trauma. I'm sure you're all familiar with the term ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. In the police, we talk more about trauma-informed practice because trauma doesn't have to be in your childhood. You can be experiencing it now as an adult, and it can have a huge effect on your vulnerability. But obviously, anyone who's carrying either historic or current trauma is going to be there. And that's exactly what Catherine's just put in the chat as well. Very good. Ooh. Apology, I've just had a pop-up on my screen. Can I just confirm, can you all hear me okay? I've got a pop-up saying networking is blocked until the problem is resolved. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, good. Hopefully that's just a technical issue. Apologies. Right, next one. Again, we've had people mentioning this. Social isolation or social difficulties, the inability to work with others, this is where neurodivergence quite often comes into it, the lack of confidence to talk to authorities, to family members, and certainly if you are isolated from support, you are far more likely to be vulnerable to exploitation. Language barriers, another great one. There are loads of these still coming through. Somebody mentioned this on the chat, economic vulnerability. If you are poor, poverty, this is going to mean that you are ripe for the exploiter to have a go at. I don't think I need to emphasize it too much, but just take a second to think, especially if you have children. If you didn't know whether you were going to be able to feed them next week, and someone approached you with an offer of 200 quid to deliver a package somewhere, which you knew was dodgy, it was likely to be drugs, would you be tempted? I would definitely be tempted. I hope I wouldn't do it, but it shows how nowadays, if someone comes up to me and says 200 quid to deliver this package, I'll probably nick them. But if I was on the breadline, if I didn't have anywhere else to turn, I'm trying to support my family, it does open your eyes to how significant an issue it can be. And that leads on to the homelessness or insecure accommodation status. Cuckooing is part of this. Everybody needs somewhere where they feel safe. If they are homeless or they don't have somewhere they can call home as a permanent place, it leaves them more vulnerable. Again, this is another one that seems obvious, but when you dig into it, there are bits that might surprise you. Obviously, if your best mate is in a gang, you are far more likely to get involved with what he's doing than you are. That's the obvious side of it. Yeah. Oh, Melanie, that's a really good point. No recourse to public funds. Yes. And we're going to come on to that in a minute. So the obvious side is clear to everyone, but do remember the gangs are not particularly honourable. Let's imagine you have an estranged brother who's in a gang and he meets with an accident, he dies, or he runs away, leaves to go abroad, leaving a debt in the gang. Well, quite often, those gangs and those involved in criminal activity will say that the debt has passed on to their family members. They've had no connection with the gang in the past, but if they don't want to get beaten up, have their house burnt down, whatever it may be, they need to pay off that debt. So it's very, very insidious. Many of you mentioned these things: physical or learning disabilities, and particularly neurodivergent. Again, it's a question of being able to recognize that you're being exploited and being able to communicate that and accessing support. Somebody else put on there, in fact, 3 of you put on mental health issues. Quite clear that exploiters target people with poor emotional well-being and especially with low self-esteem, where they feel they've got nothing to lose. We've had loads of people talking about addiction, using drink or drugs. If I can just ask, if you can try and keep yourselves on mute, it's really helpful. I know there's someone who I think might be having computer issues. It keeps popping off, but it's a bit distressing. If you can try and keep on mute, that would be very helpful. But yes, using drink or drugs to excess. So addiction. It means they've got to get it from somewhere. They've got to pay for it somehow. And particularly with drugs, it's not a cheap way to go around to access these things. So quite a lot of the time they find themselves trapped by their dealers. In order to access the drink or the drugs that they want, they have to commit crimes, do things they're not comfortable with. Someone further upstream put care leavers. The government says being in care, that's obviously most likely to apply to children, but what we're focusing on are the care leavers. Now, this is not criticism of any agency or anyone on this call. We all know we still have a problem nationwide with care leavers at the age of 18. They've had support, they've had places to turn, but that transition when they go from leaving care is still a bit of an issue for some children. We are doing our very best to provide transitional care, and I recognise that. But what it does mean is that the children are more vulnerable at that stage, and the young adults are more vulnerable. And then, as Melanie was saying, insecure immigration status, and it has 2 strands. Hers, no recourse to public funds. If they want help, they're going to have to pay for it themselves. And that puts a huge barrier in their way. But simply, what we find with cannabis farms is the vast majority of people who tend the cannabis farms are illegal immigrants. It's not are people who haven't got permission to stay in the country yet, if we phrase it like that. This is because people who own those farms want some protection. They want to know that the people they're employing aren't going to go running to authorities. And if you have someone whose immigration status is insecure, they're not going to want to speak to authorities at all because they will be terrified they're going to be deported. So all of those are factors that can make an adult more vulnerable. But there are two things to remember particularly. Firstly, please remember those factors do not or are not the cause of exploitation. Instead, they cause the imbalance of power between the victim and the suspect. And it's when the perpetrator abuses that imbalance that it becomes exploitation. And secondly, nobody is safe. Yes, if you come across an adult with a lot of those risk factors, we've got to be on the lookout. But just because none of those risk factors are present doesn't mean that they can't be exploited. There are many recorded cases of exploitation of individuals who have no known risk factors. They've never been involved with different services, and these are sought after. There's even a term for them among the perpetrators, which is clean skins. Because if the authorities aren't aware of them, they haven't had any dealings previously, they are less likely to attract attention. So anyone is vulnerable, but the risk factors we saw on the last slide make you more vulnerable. Okay, we talked about exploitation not being a criminal offence in and of itself. Obviously, I'm a police officer. Our main role is to try to catch the perpetrators of vulnerable adult exploitation and make sure that they face justice. But we have to examine what offences we can use to do that. Again, in the chat, if you get a minute, can you think of what types of criminal offences do you think are associated with exploitation of vulnerable adults? Drug mules, definitely. So we're looking at drugs offences, use, supply, cannabis farming. Finance fraud. Fraud is a very big one. Sexual offences, 100%. Forced marriage, that's a really interesting one. Yes, cuckooing, definitely. Just so we can see if anyone's got any more ideas, and then we'll go through what I've got on my list, but you've ticked off many of them so far. Okay, well, nobody's mentioned the two most obvious ones yet, because when we're talking about criminal exploitation, the first offence that we think about is modern day slavery. If you are abusing your power over someone to the extreme, the chances are you are treating them as a slave. And in the modern day sense, this is places like brothels, where they've imported or arranged for the transport of people from other countries to come in, and they are holding them in that house against their will in order to make money from them. There've been several national stories about cases involving the travelling community at times where they picked up homeless people on the street. As I was explaining before, they target the homeless. They've offered them a job and then they keep them in shocking conditions and don't allow them to speak to authorities. All of these are very serious offences that we'll look into and try and pin them to. And the second one is human trafficking. Linked to my example about the brothel, what most people think about this is when the perpetrators arrange for someone to come into the country so they can exploit them once they're here. But it can also be done within the country. The only examples I've got for children, but it applies equally to vulnerable adults. We have in the past had convictions for human trafficking where the abuser had bought the train ticket for the child, had arranged for them to carry a product with them and arranged for them to go to a different part of the country. Because forcing someone into or coercing them into travel is human trafficking in itself. But those are the two big ones. There are a lot of different ones that aren't so obviously associated. Theft. Very commonly, one of the most common types of criminal exploitation, forcing someone to do a criminal act against their will, involves shoplifting. They may be given a shopping list of items that are needed or a target shop to go to pick out stuff. We often catch them, the actual victim of the exploitation, who is doing the shoplifting, but they're not our main target. They're not who we're looking to get. And we do our best to try and identify who's running the organised crime group that's arranging these thefts. Catherine earlier on mentioned about drug use, drug supply, cannabis farms, things like that. And also about fraud, and in particular benefit fraud is another one that I'll talk about organised crime groups. They're known as OCGs. The OCGs will quite often organise for people to attend benefit offices, claim benefits for fictitious people, people who've died, whatever it may be, and the OCG will siphon off most of that money. They try and stay in the background so they're not at risk. The person that we catch more easily is actually the victim of exploitation themselves. Begging, very similar to theft or shoplifting. Sometimes they're taken to a town they don't even know, told to stay there for 10, 12 hours, they'll be picked up again, and then the OCG again will take the skimming off the top. Obviously, violence offences, if someone is being beaten up in order to get them to do something, then we can look at assault, we can look at actual bodily harm, grievous bodily harm, whatever may be on there. We talked on the previous slide about blackmail. That in itself is a criminal offence, and sextortion, we will always try and get them for blackmail if we can. And then some of the most serious ones are false imprisonment and kidnap. Forced marriage would fall under that as well. And cuckooing could quite often fall into that level as an offence, because if they're being falsely imprisoned even within their own home, that is an offence. So we have to think a bit creatively. Now, there are two ones that I want to look at in a little bit more depth. Firstly, cuckooing itself. Talked about what it meant earlier on. So where someone takes over the home of a vulnerable individual in order to use that property as a base for criminal activity. What do you think, if you are visiting that vulnerable person, what signs or indications might you get that they're being cuckooed? Is there anything that you pick up on a visit? Pop it in the chat and see if anyone can think of anything. If you can't, it's not a problem. I'll just give you 10 more seconds. If nothing comes up, I'll go through them. But these are some of the things to be on the lookout for. Okay. Firstly, pretty obviously, if you go round and you've been dealing with this individual for 2 or 3 months, you've had several visits, and suddenly there are unfamiliar individuals who are either staying at the address or coming to or going from the address, or if you've got access to the key fob records and there's an sudden increase in activity showing that people are coming in and out a lot more frequently, it's an indication that you should be on the lookout to see is there anything else that concerns you. Similarly, when you arrive at the address, if you have to battle your way through crowds, or you can see several people hanging around outside, in your view, might possibly use drink or drugs to excess. Or one of the key points that the government says is if there are takeaway deliveries at unusual hours, it indicates drug use. And if your client, the person you're looking after, is not a drug user, or this is behaviour out of their normal behaviour, sorry, that didn't make any sense. If this behaviour is unusual for them, then it can again be a sign of cuckooing. Now, this is not something where you'd phone 999 and say, oh, they're being cuckooed. It's something to take a note of, keep the evidence, and let other agencies know so we can put the information together. For those of you particularly who work in housing, you might get reports from neighbours about late night parties, arguments, other signs of antisocial behaviour littering around the property, particularly drug paraphernalia, needles, things like that. And damage to the property itself, broken windows or doors, because those that are doing the cuckooing don't care about the state of the address. They've got no pride in it because they don't live there. So it can be a sign that someone is being cuckooed. And any reports from neighbours or anyone else about threats or intimidation, if they've gone around, knocked on the door and said, can you keep it down a bit, and somebody's been threatening or aggressive, doesn't mean that it's necessarily cuckooing, but it is an indication that it could be. Now, cuckooing is a really difficult offence for police, local authorities, housing associations to deal with. But we can try, where we've got the evidence, to take action to evict the offenders and support the victim to regain control of their property. We can use applications such as civil orders, closure orders, community protection notices, and they can be used to close down premises that are being used for criminal activities, but we do have to have evidence of that going on. What we need to do in those cases is always consider how, if we use this order, what impact is it going to have on the victim's safety? Is it going to put them more at risk? And the other offence I wanted to look at in a bit more depth was county lines. Now, when the term was first introduced, county lines, it was because the most common model was for the OCGs, the organised crime groups, to be based in London, Manchester, Birmingham, and then to recruit local talent from Hampshire and the Isle of Wight to go up to their city across different county lines, collect the drugs, go back to their home area and sell it. And that's why it became known as county lines. Just be interested to know, does anybody on the call know there was one, it's not even a piece of property, but one thing that can be sold by the organised crime group if they decide to move away from the area and want to pass it on, very valuable, the one thing that they can sell to the next OCG that's moving in. It's something called a deal line. A specific phone number that is used for arranging the sale of drugs and the delivery of drugs and all of this sort of thing, how to actually operate it. The deal line itself, that phone number can go for thousands of pounds sometimes if it's a very valuable one. Now, as I said, county lines originally meant going over county lines, but in modern policing, it's much more common for it to happen within a county. So you might have an OCG based in Basingstoke who have a deal line and have local recruits from Southampton, Portsmouth, Alton, the New Forest, Emsworth. It's still referred to as county lines, even though it doesn't fit the specific definition. These people are equally likely to exploit children and vulnerable adults, and they will use coercion, intimidation, and violence, including sexual violence and weapons, in order to get compliance. So that's the background to exploitation. Some of the offences we use, how do we do it? What about for you in your day-to-day practice? What advice can we give you? Well, firstly, there are some warning signs to be on the lookout for. Firstly, consider the behaviour of the person you're concerned about. Now, when it comes to going missing, it's a lot more difficult with adults than it is with children. Children get reported missing if they're 10 minutes late sometimes. Adults, it can take a lot more to have them reported missing. But if you notice that they regularly go missing from home or they go missing out of character, particularly if they're unwilling to explain their whereabouts, what's happened to them, then that should be raising your alarm bells. You also need to have a look and see if they are self-harming or if they're suicidal and they have that low self-esteem. It is a red flag. It is a huge vulnerability factor. If you can see it, so can the perpetrators, and they are much more likely to be being exploited. When it comes to possessions, probably the one that you're most familiar with, you have someone who's on benefits, struggling to make ends meet, regularly goes to the food bank. The next time you see them, they've got a new iPhone and a new pair of trainers, and they don't want to tell you where it came from. That is a huge red flag that the chances are they're being exploited by someone. But there are also things like if they've got excessive receipt of texts or phone calls, If they've got multiple SIM cards or handsets, in particular, if they've got an old phone that's not internet enabled, it has an unregistered SIM, this could be a burner phone. And that's one that is used because it's hard to trace it for the police and it's used for drug deals. Always, if you're aware of a relationship, not just a romantic relationship, but friendships, people staying the night and so on, look for that imbalance of power in any relationship, particularly if, other than that relationship, your client is isolated. They've got nowhere else to turn. The only person they're with has got power over them. That leaves them really vulnerable. Do look out for signs of any physical or psychological abuse. Obviously, broken bones, big black eyes, things like that are quite clear. But look for small things like cigarette burns, small cuts that could be a way of psychologically abusing the victim to threaten them with further violence later if they don't comply. Online activity is really hard to spot because so many of us are on the internet most of the time anyway. But if you happen to notice there's sudden increased or excessive amounts of time online during both day and night, that can be a sign. But look more at what they're doing there. Are they secretive about who they're talking to? Are they sharing excessive and inappropriate amounts of personal information? Romance frauds are a big one here, where somebody who's lonely and looking for love believes they've found their ideal mate on the internet, and they start sharing not just address and phone number details, sometimes financial details. They'll pay them money. They are being scammed. And it's really hard sometimes to convince them of this. I'm sure many of you have come across what we call in the police plugging, or internally concealing drugs. It's done normally in one of two ways. It normally involves a condom that they fill with the drugs that they're trying to conceal, and they either swallow it or they secrete it in an orifice somewhere. So if you happen to notice that they're in possession of lubricants or condoms and they're not sexually active or something like that, or if they are physically unwell, and in particular, if they refuse to consume food or drink, because if they eat and drink, it will mean they have to go to the toilet, at which point the drugs may appear before they're wanted. All of these are signs that they might be being forced into plugging. If they have either deposits or withdrawals of large amounts that are unexplained in their accounts, it could be a sign of either exploitation or debt bondage. If they've got a sudden urgent preoccupation with earning money and asking for money or stealing or borrowing it, is it because they've got a debt that they're having to pay off on threat of violence? Understandably, a lot of them don't want to talk to us. Now, most people, even those that criticise the police all day, every day, and criticise social services and the council and so on, if they get into trouble, the first thing they do is phone for help for whoever's necessary. The ones that don't are the ones with something to fear most of the time. They think if they contact authority, if they tell you what's going on, they will get into trouble. And so it can be a sign of exploitation. If they don't fully comply with you, if they don't want to tell you what's going on, it should be a red flag or a warning signal to you. And then finally, especially if they come from abroad, they're not UK citizens, if they don't have access to their identification documents, their passport, is this because someone is holding it to have a hold over them, to keep them under their control? So be on the lookout for those signs. If you come across someone that you believe is being exploited, a vulnerable adult, the first piece of advice I would give is very, very simple. If there is an immediate risk of harm, call 999. That's what the police are there for. We need to prevent any immediate risk of harm. The problem is, as you'll have seen, a lot of the signs of cuckooing and of exploitation in general are very vague. They're not even a sign that a criminal offence is taking place. Certainly, they don't show that someone is at immediate risk of harm. So what can you do there? Well, the first thing, do your very best to safeguard the victim. Take whatever actions you can take and document what you've done to try and keep that victim safe. It may be excuse me, arranging for them to move to another address, a house swap, might be changing their locks, fitting CCTV, it might be alerting neighbours or family to the problems that are going on. But take some responsibility to do for yourself everything you can to make that victim as safe as possible. And then probably the most important step overall, share the information. The key and cornerstone to safeguarding is information sharing. If all agencies know everything about someone that is at risk, we have a much better chance of providing appropriate safeguarding and lowering that risk than if there is stuff we don't know. This also applies in particular, often you're not working in isolation. You might be a social worker who attends the address for that client, but you know that the housing officer also goes there. And you've seen this risk, but you think, oh, well, the housing officer knows it as well. They'll probably put in the safeguarding referral. Never assume someone else will do it. Always take responsibility to do it yourself. If you attend together as part of a joint visit and one of you says, I will do the safeguarding referral for this, that's fine. We don't need both of you to do it because that's not an assumption you've been told. I would personally make a note on the incident saying, yes, I've spoken to John Smith and he said he will do the safeguarding referral. But if there is no guarantee someone's doing it, we would much rather have two separate safeguarding referrals about the same incident than none at all. So never assume someone else will do it. I'm hoping most of you have heard of community partnership information forms, CPIs. This is something, when we were talking about the signs of cuckooing, one of the signs is people loitering outside the address. Well, you're not going to put in a safeguarding referral simply based on that, but it's just made you a little uncomfortable and you want to do something with that information. Share the information as best you can, and the way to do that with the police is through a community partnership information form. If you send that into the police, it acts as intelligence. It helps us build the picture of what the safeguarding risk is. Now, if anybody is unfamiliar with what CPIs are, Andrew's very kindly said he's going to send the slides out afterwards. There is a link here, which isn't working at the moment. It worked when I first did it. I'm just going to try it one more time. No, it's not doing it. I'll try and get the link. I'll send it to Andrew again. But there is a training package online, 35 minutes. You can watch at your leisure, all about community partnership information forms, what they are, how to fill them in, and when they should be used. So you can watch that for yourself. Then, having done your safeguarding referral, you've let your partners know about it. You've raised it as a concern. You go back to the address and nothing seems to be happening. You're concerned that nothing is going on. Well, consider escalation if necessary. There is a specific policy. Oh, I think it's my intranet that's down at the moment, unfortunately. That was obviously the message I had. But there is an escalation policy. Again, that link will take you to it. It's not saying that someone's incompetent or not doing their job properly. It is a way of raising concerns in a professional, courteous and polite manner to say, actually, I think we need to do some more. Overall, the best advice I can give you, if you're facing someone who may be being exploited, is the same advice in general as for any other issue that you come across. Firstly, put the victim first. Don't dismiss them because they don't think they're being exploited. A lot of the time, the victims of exploitation do not see at the time that they are victims. They think they're perfectly comfortable with what's going on. This is especially the case when they're transitioning into adulthood. Young adults don't recognise, they think they're Jack the Lad and they know how to look after themselves. So please remember that individuals who've been groomed and exploited into criminal activity have not chosen freely to become involved. They can't consent to being exploited, and they should be seen as victims first and foremost. Secondly, always be professionally curious. Use your eyes and ears, look around, make a note of what you see that concerns you. Keep a log of any unusual activity. If you come across any evidence, such as train tickets, receipts from out of area, messages, images, or videos online, then make sure that you preserve that evidence. And where possible, try and build rapport and trust with the victim. And in those reachable moments, try to find out what's going on. Above all, when it comes to safeguarding, we always advocate a multi-agency approach. Don't deal with it on your own. We all have our own specialities and areas of expertise. Police, obviously, it's crime. Your areas will be, social care for social workers, health for the health team, etc. We can't be experts in each other's field, so use your partners. I'm hoping you are all familiar with the multi-agency risk management meetings, MARMs, open to any agency to call a MARM, anyone working for it. If you have concerns about an adult and you think a multi-agency approach might work, then do consider a MARM. And there is a lot of information on the Isle of Wight Adults Board and the other boards, Hampshire, Southampton, Portsmouth, about MARMs if you want to know more about those. The final tip I'll give you is one that's been found in some serious case reviews to be where we fail occasionally, which is to listen to the families. Families should be considered as safeguarding partners in this. They know the victim really, really well. We need to listen to their concerns seriously, discuss solutions with them, try to recognise with their help what will work best for their family member. If you want to know any more about the exploitation, now it's of children and vulnerable adults, but this is the document that, it's not going to let me, really sorry about this. I don't know why it's not letting me go in, but the link here will take you to the government website that talks in depth about the signs, the response that we need to any exploitation of vulnerable adults and children. The other three sites are for signposting to victims. For exploitation and county lines, there is a specific helpline and charity involved that will support anyone involved in it and their families and give them advice on where to go. The second one, or the third one down here, is about sex workers. Now, it does focus on women, understandably, because the vast majority of those who are sexually exploited are women, but it doesn't exclude men or any different gender at all. They will help them. And then finally, the Causeway charity is devoted to exploitation of people with learning disabilities and neurodiversity. They are excellent ways to get help and to signpost families to, so that they can speak to the charities and the experts in that area to get all the help they need. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me for 50 minutes. If anyone has any questions at all, please either type them in the chat or feel free to come off mute and ask me direct if you prefer.
I think you've awed everyone into silence there, Jim, but thank you very much indeed.
No worries.
I found that very interesting, and I'm sure it's going to be very useful for everyone who's attended. So thanks again for everyone for attending. I've put some contact details for the Isle of Wight site in the chat. If you're not from the island, there's also a safeguarding page on there, a Safeguarding Adults Week page on there that will give links for all the activities in the 4LSAB area. And if there's no more questions, we'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Apologies for technical issues, not being able to get onto the internet. Could I ask you,
okay,
before you send it out, can you just open the slides and just make sure those links work for you?
I have actually. I've dropped a message in the chat there, Jim. I can confirm it does work. Yes. So I'll be sending that out to everyone as soon as I can. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody.